And it's obviously must be extremely disappointing to many longstanding members of the Liberal Party of Canada. It's not surprising that we have a number of ministers who've decided not to run for re-election. We have a number of MPs deciding not to run for re-election. There is a phrase that I'm not going to use, but it's clear that they too look at the polls and they know that public opinion is changing. It's changing for a number of reasons, Mr. Chair. There's always, and always has been, a shelf life for any political party. That applies to the Liberal Party, that applies to the Conservative Party. People get tired of being promised a number of things pre-election merely to buy a vote and then to be profoundly disappointed when the Prime Minister of the day does not deliver. And that's precisely what's happening with Justin Trudeau. I'm sure he and the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, and the entire Finance Department, if not the entire Liberal bench, thought that the spring budget would finally end some negativity towards their economic policies, that they were going to make it fairer for a number of generations, that it wasn't strictly about the middle class. Now it's fairness for multiple generations. But what are we seeing in the budget? We're seeing the same worn-out talking points that Justin Trudeau promised Canadians in 2015 and completely has not delivered on, particularly in the area, in my view, of public safety. And I'm going to get to relevant points in due course. But it's just indicative, emblematic of why this party and its members are just so desperate to find something other than to take a look at their track record. The budget has fallen flat on its face. One could have made the argument that the Prime Minister was going to drop the writ 2 or 3 weeks ago with his cross-country tour and all his ministers following along and delivering all these little goodies as to what they can expect from the budget. But nothing has moved the channel because Canadians are wise and Canadians are intelligent. And they have finally realized that this Prime Minister, who they thought was going to conduct governance so much more differently. Let's all remember his famous words in 2015, how he would do politics different, that his administration would be known as the most transparent, accountable, and responsible government this country has ever seen. But then you take a look at everything that has transpired. Their non-willingness to provide documents at committee, instructing their members to filibuster when it comes to exposing elements of corruption and unethical behavior. The list goes on and on and on. I could spend hours doing a deep dive, just taking a look at the number of scandals that has rocked Justin Trudeau and members of his cabinet, members of his backbench, literally since 2015. Canadians are wise individuals, Mr. Chair, and they remember these things. So with all the good efforts that the Liberal members of this committee are trying to do now, trying to scare Canadians and fearmonger, in my view, is going to fall flat on its face. Let's take, for instance, this whole concept of the scariness of the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause, surprise, surprise, introduced by Justin's father himself, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, well over 40 years ago. And that notwithstanding clause in the last 40-plus years has not been amended. It has been in the books for a very long time. And while no federal government has exercised its use, does not necessarily mean, in fact, I'll say definitively, does not mean that it's inappropriate to use it in the future. We know that some provincial premiers have used it. You know, and where was the backlash from Justin Trudeau? Well, I guess there was a little bit of backlash. He talked a good game, but he didn't do anything about it. When Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, talked about it, when the Premier of Quebec talked about it, this is something that is law in this country. And for all the non-lawyers on the Liberal bench, I invite them all to take the time, it'll take you less than 2 minutes, to actually read Section 33 of the Charter. That when used, clearly, and I'm just paraphrasing it, when used, it's not permanent. It's reviewable at 5 years. So when we take a look at the comments recently made by our leader, these are comments, Mr. Chair, that have not changed or been altered in any which way from the first moment that he talked about the applicable use of the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause, despite the best efforts of Ms. Khalid to try to open up the floodgates and widen the potential abuse of the notwithstanding clause to scare Canadians to be fearful of the use of that clause, because now it might be applied to reproductive rights, is an absolute joke. And it's offensive, because she knows full well, as does every member of that Liberal bench, where the Conservative Party of Canada stands on that issue. Dead stop.